Hello, welcome to Rappler Talk. I'm Marites Vitug, and joining us is David Timberman. He's based in New York for the moment, but he's the Asia Programs Coordinator for Freedom House, which is based in Washington, D.C. David is an old Southeast Asia hand, and he knows the Philippines so well that he can explain to us the US elections and the Philippine elections, which we will do later in this interview. Welcome, David, to Rappler Talk. And of course, the main subject we'll talk about is the US elections, which is the most watched elections in the world. Is that an exaggeration, David?
No, I think that's probably pretty accurate, Mary Tess. So first, let me say thanks for inviting me to do this interview. As a long-time observer of the Philippines, I want to underscore how important Rappler is for those of, well, for people in the Philippines, but especially now for those of us who cannot visit the Philippines, for understanding what's going on in the Philippines. So I'm happy to be able to participate in this interview. Then let me just give you the audience a little bit more background on my current position and the capacity in which I'll be talking today. So I am the Director of Asia Programs for Freedom House. Freedom House is a nonpartisan American NGO that assesses democracy and freedom in countries around the world, including in the United States. We don't endorse any US administration or political party, but every year we do assess the quality of the democracy in the US as well as in most other countries in the world. And we have observed a gradual decline in American democracy over the last 9 years or so. You know, it's in the context of that trend, I think that we'll have this conversation. But let me also say, Mary Tess, that because Freedom House is a nonpartisan organization, I want to make it clear that I'm speaking with you today in my personal capacity. And as you mentioned, really as somebody who's been a longtime observer of sort of the challenges that democracies face, both in Southeast Asia, but also, as I mentioned, in the United States. And because many of them are similar, although they play out in somewhat different ways.
So, David, the first thing I'm going to ask you is the US election under threat, and what are the threats being faced in this 2020 elections? And is this the first time in your contemporary history that the US election may face disastrous consequences, as we've heard Trump say that he will not concede, he wasn't categorical about endorsing a peaceful transition.
Right. Well, let me say that if you're referring to my contemporary experience, I'm pretty old now, so that does go back quite a ways. And yes, certainly in my own personal experience, this is the most worrisome election that the United States has faced. But let's also, I want to broaden out the frame a little bit because it's not only about what President Trump has said he will or won't accept. I mean, I think it's, as a point of departure, it's really important to understand, you know, that there are just multiple threats to the conduct and the perceived legitimacy of this upcoming election. So these include, you know, obviously just the challenges faced by the COVID pandemic, the hyper-partisanship that, you know, the U.S. has experienced now for so long, the problems of disinformation and the threat of hacking from foreign malign actors, but also just in terms of the administration. I mean, it's important to understand that unlike in the Philippines, you know, voting is managed at the state level. So you've got 50 or so different procedures from state to state. And so that presents challenges, but also can cause confusion when you try to understand what's going on. But then in addition to that, there have been efforts at voter suppression, and sort of the flip side of that is that we will almost certainly see a surge in mail-in balloting, in part because of COVID, but not exclusively. And along with that, and this is where some of the things that the president have said start to come into play, an effort to discredit the integrity of mail-in voting, but also just the reality that it's going to take time to, at the state level again, to tally those votes. So you add all of those together and you've already got, a very challenging and possibly problematic mix of factors. And then you add to that, as you mentioned, the fact that the president has attacked the integrity of mail-in voting in particular, and has said that he might not concede, which as a longtime observer of the Philippines reminds me of what one frequently hears in the Philippines, that candidates never lose elections, they are stolen from them. We're now hearing our president echo some of the things that Filipinos are used to hearing.
So maybe he's read from our playbook or from other countries' playbook. But do you see this leading to a constitutional crisis? There's been a lot of articles, reports that the US, the wellspring of democracies, may face a constitutional crisis.
Yeah, you can't, in this situation, you can't rule anything out, but, and this is important, but I think it's premature to anticipate a constitutional crisis. But there are at least two areas I think that are certainly of concern. One of them is predictable in a sense, and that is that we have the undemocratic anachronism of the Electoral College, which, as some of your audience may know, is actually what determines the outcome of the election, not the popular vote, like in the Philippines. And the Electoral College gives somewhat greater weight to less populated rural areas, which tend to vote Republican. But also, given again the hyper partisan nature of and the sort of winner do or die, winner takes all kind of situation with American politics right now, we could see contests at the state level over how the electoral votes are counted, and that in fact could lead to all sorts of legal and eventually possibly constitutional issues. But the second, so that's one, and the second, much less predictable possibility is that's talked about is that if the president attempts to stop the count or simply rejects it, and then then it's really a dual political and constitutional crisis, with probably the political crisis coming first. But again, it's, that would play out, again, without wanting to get too speculative, but that would play out in the context of, what the popular vote looks like. And if it goes strongly in one direction or the other, that, that will have, that obviously will be an important contextual factor. And also the results of the Senate and the House races. And if those go strongly in one way or the other, those will be important contextual factors too. But like I say, you can't rule anything out. And at the end of the day, we also might find that, and this reminds me a little bit again of the Philippines, with the U.S. sending emissaries to talk to Marcos. But maybe it'll require, Republicans who aren't diehard Trump loyalists to step up and intervene on, on behalf of the country, on behalf of, to preserve the legitimacy of the electoral process.
But David, can President Trump stop the count? Is that constitutional? Will they follow him? Will the states follow a directive? I mean, a verbal order from the president?
I don't think it's constitutional. And again, I'm not predicting that this will happen. But again, it'll be about the politics of it. And so again, in some states, this is why the states are so important in all of this. Some states have Democratic governors and, maybe have mixed legislatures. Some states have Republican governors and mixed. So you have, it will depend, it will be very much on a state by state basis, if there are controversies, how they get, at least initially, play out.
And David, do you see the military playing a role here? There was an open letter from two retired Army generals to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, talking about upholding democracy and all that. I was so surprised, David. It sounded like it came from the Philippines. But do you see the military playing a political role in this election?
No, I mean, actually, this is, if there's one area where I'm fairly confident that, that institutional norms will hold, I think it's with the military. And again, we could talk about how that relates to the Philippines, but every member of the U.S. military takes an oath to defend the Constitution. Of course, the president is the commander-in-chief, but the oath is to defend the Constitution. And in addition to that, with the recent events, during the Black Lives Matter protests, the military and I think a number more just everyday citizens have seen and have, for the most part, rejected the president's efforts to use the military to support his domestic political agenda. So I'm not too concerned with that. That said, the bigger risk, I think, is that if there was serious post-election, or if there were serious post-election protests by the left or by the right, how the Trump administration and local authorities handles them, will be very important. So again, as we saw during the height of the Black Lives Matter protests, the president has the authority to deploy the armed forces, the National Guard, which are state-based, but still the National Guard, and various units of federal agencies like Homeland Security. So the president can activate quite a few forces under his command. Also, in the wake of Black Lives Matter, there are serious strains between local police forces, some of which are highly militarized in the U.S., and political activists, some of whom are very militant. So again, you could see, sort of the militarization of responses to protests post-election that don't necessarily actually involve the armed forces.
But if election results reach the courts, you have independent state courts, but the Supreme Court's independence is now in question. Would the courts be able to resolve fairly these election contests or protests? You said you had strong institutions.
Yeah. Again, yeah. I mean, because the election management is largely state-based, right? Almost certainly the first case would be to go to state courts, but of course those rulings could be appealed to higher courts, including the Supreme Court. I wouldn't assume that the U.S. Supreme Court is not independent. There are certainly political orientations, and it certainly has an orientation that's more conservative than liberal. But the court, and I would say this may be a little bit true of the Philippine Supreme Court too, but the court does not act, at least the U.S. Supreme Court does not act in complete isolation of what sort of broader political trends are. I mean, it can sometimes and for some period of time, but so again, I think if you saw a fairly decisive vote in favor of one candidate as opposed to the other, I think, I'm just guessing here, I'm not an expert on the US Supreme Court, but I'm guessing that the justices would think very carefully again about intervening in what's a highly politically charged issue, and one that may in fact be somewhat decisive in terms of the actual vote.
So let's zoom out a bit, David. So what's at stake in this US election? Well, of course, for America, and then for us, for our part of the world, Southeast Asia, we're also watching this closely, and you understand our region very well.
Sure. Well, so to begin with, what's at stake for the United States?
Yes,
and
then
Americans,
for the region, for us.
Sure. So first, and again, let me just underscore, these are my own personal views. They don't represent Freedom House's views. I mean, first and foremost, and we've been there with the Philippines too. The integrity and the legitimacy of the electoral process in itself is just, a fundamental element of any liberal democracy. So getting through this process with the process legitimate and accepted is, I mean, huge in its own right? And I mean, in the past we took it for granted. Now we really, this time around, we can't really take it for granted. So that's the first. Then, I mean, as you might imagine, there are a wide variety of domestic policies that would change or remain the same or change. Clearly the addressing the COVID pandemic and related to that, the how to resuscitate the economy. In the U.S., the issue of healthcare continues to be obviously very, very important and contentious. For those who are concerned about climate change, a change in party will result in a very significant change in, the U.S. government's acknowledgement of and willingness to address climate change. This question that has erupted, at least most dramatically in the last couple of years, about structural racism in the United States. Again, not that it will necessarily be addressed, but a willingness to acknowledge and start to address an issue like that. And then lastly, just the very notion of, what the United States is with regard to, particularly with regard to pluralism. Do we see ourselves as a sort of inclusive, pluralistic society, or one that's more exclusionary? So those are, I think, are all big issues that are at stake here. I would also say that, and this goes to the nature of the current political situation. I mean, the issue of respect for conventions and norms that underpin liberal democracy I think, are definitely at stake. These are sort of less tangible than actual policy issues, but in many ways equally, if not more important over the long term. So, things like respect for political opposition, respect for checks and balances, nonpartisan application of the law, a commitment to truthfulness in governance, and a preference for civility, over sort of demonization of your political rivals or your critics. So, I mean, those, I think, again, values and norms are also something that are at stake in this election.
We can perfectly relate to those values and norms here, David. They're also, they're going to be at stake in the 2022 elections here. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I imagine they will be. So, what's at stake for Southeast Asia?
Yes.
I'm not so sure it's as, I don't think there are the same sort of, I don't want to say existential, but fundamental issues at stake for Southeast Asia, but which is not to say they're not important still. But, so to begin with, it's important to understand that, the next president and the Congress in the US will really be focusing on, a myriad of domestic problems. I mean, many of them rooted in the issues that I just, ticked off. COVID, the economy, the polarization that's occurred, hopefully not sort of having to respond to a less than legitimate election, all of those. So I mean, the point being that I think the U.S. government is going to be, by necessity, pretty heavily focused on domestic and internal affairs at least in the short term. And then secondly, even if that weren't as much the case as it's likely to be, it's always been very difficult to get at least an American president to pay much attention to Southeast Asia. Sorry to say that, but that's really the case. That's the truth. But what could it mean? I think, if there's a change in administration, I think we'll see a more predictable U.S. engagement with the region, and also a more predictable U.S. policy vis-a-vis China, which of course the two are very closely interrelated. But so they'll at least be more predictability, probably less personality driven, and probably less transactional. But that said, I think there'll still be continuing pressure put by the U.S. On Southeast Asian countries, to support a U.S. agenda to limit Chinese influence across the region. So I don't think that will change, although the ways perhaps that it's done will be different. I think we would also see probably a new regional trade initiative of some form. I don't really know what that would look like, but that would seem likely as a way, one way for the U.S. to engage more in East Asia. And then I think we would see at least some greater attention paid to human rights and democracy around Southeast Asia. Although again, I think there are limits on how much that would be in actual practice.
So maybe, David, just for the Philippines, how would you see a Biden administration relating to Duterte, very different norms and values if Biden wins? I mean, they don't share the same values, and also the pivot to China of Duterte. How do you see a new administration dealing with the Philippines?
Yeah. Here I can only guess. I don't have, even though I'm based in the US, I don't have any sort of particular insights into what that might look like. But so here's my guess. I think the basic strategy might simply be to run out the clock on the Duterte administration. And I say that in part because there probably won't be a new U.S. ambassador appointed to the Philippines until early in the next year. So that will be the case. If there's a political transition in the U.S., it takes time for that to those appointments to be made and positions filled and policies reviewed. And so by, you get into the spring of next year, and at that point, the Philippines is entering into its, it's presidential election cycle. And so, President Duterte presumably will be less of a factor, at least in terms of the future bilateral relationship. So basically just wait it out. I think that's, in the short term, I think that's what might happen. The one wild card there, which I have no particular insights on, is, if the visiting forces agreement again becomes, if the suspension of the revocation is unsuspended and revoked, whether that then becomes a significant bilateral issue, and I'm not sure how that would. I don't have a view on how that would play out.
I think just one more final question, David, because we don't have a lot of time. So, has the U.S. been humbled by the Trump presidency because it has declined? U.S. has declined as a leader of the democratic world. So, what lessons will the new administration? Can the new administration learn from a declining America?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, part of the answer, I think, is, well, the lessons are lessons that foreign policy professionals in former administrations just have been it's underscored the importance of prior approaches, I think. So one lesson is that, one lesson is don't do it this way, and there are better ways to conduct foreign policy. But that said, I mean, there are, I think, there are some other important lessons that actually can and maybe will be learned. One would be that there needs to be a broader domestic constituency for trade deals. So you just can't assume that globalization, multilateral trade deals, that sort of thing, will be politically acceptable. I think we probably learned that lesson. Kind of related to that, there probably needs to be a better job done demonstrating the benefits of our alliances around the world, to show Americans, that they do have value, and it's not just that other countries are taking advantage of us. Third would be, I think President Trump has and his administration have shifted the discourse on China, towards a tougher stand on China. And so I think that's now the norm. So it's not exactly a lesson, but it's the norm now. And there will be differences on how that plays out. But there's a stronger consensus about the need to take a tougher stand on China than was the case in the past. And then a couple last ones. The importance of restoring the degraded capacity and morale of the U.S. State Department. Not exactly a lesson, but a need. And similarly, the need to restore the integrity and autonomy of the intelligence community. These are all important, elements, important tools in U.S. foreign policy and U.S. leadership. I think these are some of the things that will need to be thought about and addressed going forward.
Thank you very much, David. I forgot to ask you if will you have foreign observers during your election? That was one idea brought up, and it just took me by surprise. Maybe we can, as you said, we can send Namfrel.
I was going to say, let's send the people who wrote the book. So if it was up to me, I would certainly welcome Namfrel and PPCRV and other election monitors. I mean, the Filipinos have lots of experience in this area, although I think it's the challenges to American elections in this instance are a little bit different for the most part.
Okay, thank you so much, David, and to our viewers and listeners, thank you. And maybe the aftermath when we learn who will be the winner after November 3. Hope it's not extended like other countries. No. Okay,
it will
thank
be.
You. Thank you, David, and goodbye as well to our viewers.
Thank you, Mary Tess.
Thank you.